Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar discussion, Drawing the Line on Partisanship in Redistricting. My name is Kamanzi Khalisa, and I'm Director of CSG's new Overseas Voting Initiative. Last year, CSG entered into a partnership with the U.S. Department of Defense's Federal Voting Assistance Program to improve the U.S. military and overseas voting process. The initiative convenes and supports parallel working advisory groups, policy and technology that promote best practices, as well as facilitate data standardization policy solutions affecting over 5 million U.S. military and civilian overseas registered voters. Recently, redistricting policy has become highly partisan and contentious in many states. Each state has its own standards and processes for drawing state and federal legislative district lines. This CSG eCademy session will feature national experts on elections and redistricting policy to help state policymakers better understand the contemporary redistricting policy landscape, as well as discuss innovative policy solutions. Saying that, I'm pleased to be joined today by Kimball Brace, President of Election Data Services, a political consulting firm located in Manassas, Virginia, that specializes in redistricting, reapportionment, the census, and other various election administration issues. Lisa Sorenen serves as the Executive Director of the State and Local Legal Center based here in Washington, D.C. In this role, Lisa files amicus briefs to the United States Supreme Court on behalf of CSG members in cases affecting state and local government. And last but not least, Dr. Jonathan Mattingly, Professor of Mathematics and Statistical Science at Duke University. Professor Mattingly has recently conducted research involving the development of a mathematical model that shows how changes in congressional voting districts could affect election outcomes at the state and federal level. Well, thank you all for joining today's discussion. I'd like to notify the audience to feel free to submit questions throughout the session, as we will have time at the end for a Q&A segment. Kimball, we're ready whenever you are.
Thank you, Kamanzi. This is Kim Brace. I'm president of a company called Election Data Services. We've been doing redistricting for now 4 decades in more than half the nation of the country, in state and local governments all across the country. Next slide is beginning. If you look at some of the basics, it's commonly talked about in terms of reapportionment or redistricting. And what is the difference? Well, reapportionment is really the allocation of districts to an area. Such things as congressional districts going to the states, and in some states they use the reapportionment process to allocate legislative districts to counties. That's not as commonly done now, but it used to be. On the other hand, redistricting is basically the crafting of district configurations within an area. So things like congressional districts, state legislative districts, county council districts, cities, boards, all of those kind of things where you have members elected from single-member districts, those are governed by redistricting. Now, redistricting usually happens once a decade, unless, of course, you happen to be Tom DeLay in Texas, and like in last decade. Basically, from the redistricting process in the states, next slide, it is a state legislative process. It's a bill. It is the responsibility of the state legislature in most instances to draw the districts. In 37 states for the state legislative districts and 38 states for the congressional districts. Now, some states have commission processes, and then there is always Iowa, not only being the first in the country for presidential politics, but it is unique in terms of its process for redistricting, which we can get into later. Next slide. If we look at redistricting, and if it fails in the legislature, then we go to the court. Similar to what took place here in 2000, in 2010, almost as many states ended up in the court process in order to get a final determination in terms of redistricting. Next slide. One of the things that we have done over the decades, and most recently in 2010, is we do election result posters, the red and blue posters that come out after each election. Well, in 2010, when we published the results of the 2010 election, we had a backside of that poster, and that looked at a lot of relevant areas of the redistricting process. So I wanted to show that to everybody, and that poster is still available if you want to. We'll see at the end our website. Next page. Indeed, if you do and look at redistricting, as I said, in most instances, the legislature does the congressional districts. There are some commissions that do on congressional districts, but in most instances, it is the legislature. Sometimes it's commission with backup, as in Indiana or in other states, but certainly it is the legislature that is generally involved with drawing the congressional district boundaries. Next slide. If you look at the state legislative area, it's a little bit more different. Here we have some boards that come into play in drawing the state legislative districts. These tables, I must say, are from the 2010 redistricting process. There may have been a little bit of change since then, but that's something that people are looking at. These graphics that I've got for you here are from 2010. But certainly the legislature is involved in the legislative boundaries. More states do have commissions. Next slide talks about the role of the commission and where commissions are utilized for some of the process, be they an advisory commission or a backup commission. If the legislature fails to enact a plan, it may go to a commission to come up with a plan as another alternative. But you can see here where legislature and the congressional districts, those redistricting processes can be involved in some of the commission usage. Next slide. And indeed, we see here where commissions are the primary focus. They're the primary role for the commission is to do the redistricting, or in the heavier green where they're a backup commission. There are some states that do have just an advisory commission without ultimately a role. Next slide. The other thing that we're dealing with is, of course, the reapportionment process. The Census Bureau, just at the tail end of last year, put out new population numbers for 2014. One of the things that we do at Election Data Services is take numbers each year to see what the reapportionment process might look like under the new numbers that were just released. And for 2014, released in December, we see that four states are impacted with 2 districts. The state of Minnesota and Pennsylvania would be losing a congressional district, and they would be going to North Carolina and Texas. Now that's just using the numbers as it is in 2014. The next slide shows taking that trend and projecting it forward to 2020. Indeed, what we see is a continuation of the trend that has happened for multiple decades, where we see states in the Northeast and the upper Midwest losing a seat. Those red-colored states are all losing a single seat, and those seats are going to the South and to the West. The lighter green are states that will gain a single congressional district, while the state of Texas will be looking at gaining 3 congressional districts by the time we get to 2020. So once again, that continuation of a really 40-year trend of going away from the Northeast and the upper Midwest and going south and west, as the people are moving in that direction, so goes congressional districts. Next, I wanted to show everyone that one of the big issues that is right before us as we speak is looking at how the census will be taken. And in 2010, one of the key components was what is race and what is Hispanic origin. In 2010, going back to 1990, the Census Bureau has asked these questions as two separate questions. The first one, question 5, was, are you Hispanic or not? And then secondly, question 6 was, what is your race? Now, the Census Bureau is looking at whether or not to combine these two questions into a single question. There is some feeling amongst some groups that they want to add these two questions together, while other groups are against it. But right now it is before the Census Bureau and some of their advisory committees, which I served on one in last decade. They are looking at this issue, doing a bunch of studies, putting in a lot of different variations on what the questionnaire wording might be. The Census Bureau undertook the test census in Savannah, Georgia area, just started yesterday, in fact. And they're testing out what's going to happen in terms of the race and Hispanic origin question. If we go to the next slide, I wanted to give an example of what this could be and how the data comes into play. Go ahead, Carrie. And the next one is, if we look at the individual races that the Census Bureau looks at, they also have the capability of 2 or more races, which is what we've had in the last 2 decades. Indeed, if we look at just the race, the next one, if we look at race alone in this jurisdiction, we can see that all the races add up to 100%, including the 2 or more. But if we look at, you'll see that that does not include Hispanic, because Hispanic is not a race. Go to the next slide, and we'll see what happens if we add Hispanic in there. Well, in this jurisdiction, Hispanics is 26%. Well, you can't add the 100% plus the 26. And so one of the things that we do, and a lot of other people that deal with data, the next slide, is that we take the Hispanic out of the individual race groups and treat them as if they were an individual race. By doing so, then you can once again add to 100%. But you can see that there is a dramatic impact, at least right now in 2010, there was a dramatic change for 2 racial groups. One of them is the white population, and the other is the some other race, because Hispanics tend to be split about 50-50 in whether or not they are white or mark themselves as some other race. So those two groups are the most dramatically impacted on what happens when you add Hispanics in. If we go forward to the next one, indeed, one of the things that can be looked at is maybe the possibility, because in 2010, we allowed people to check off more than one race, that 2 or more column. You can see in this jurisdiction it was almost 3%. Well, if we take that 3% and distribute it to the individual race groups, we can see the difference that happens. In some instances, people call this the maximum number of an individual racial group. And you can see how that changes some of the characteristics of this jurisdiction's population. Indeed, the next one, if we take the Hispanics out of it, in the next one, Carrie, well, we can see that when you do the maximum, it does add up to more than 100% of the people, 103% in this jurisdiction's instance. Next one shows you what happens when you deal with the Hispanics being kept separately. Indeed, these numbers change, and that's one of the things that I wanted to make everyone aware of, that circumstance. Next slide is the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, gave a dicta to federal agencies on how they should deal with race And indeed, if we use that dicta, then we can see those numbers changing again. And the next slide shows that for the Hispanics also. So there is really 6 different ways of looking at this racial data depending upon how you're counting people. The next slide, indeed, what we've seen so far has been total population, but it also impacts voting age population, those persons 18 or over. And indeed, the distribution of the population changes in that regard. Because whites tend to be older and minority groups tend to be younger, there is a difference in the calculations when you look at voting age population compared to total population. Next slide. What happens is, say we have a theoretical 50% or 50-member legislature, what might be anticipated given those racial characteristics? Well, we can see that in most instances, there's not a lot of change in terms of number of seats, for example, in the African-American population, the black population, for total pop. But when you get to voting age, they start losing a seat. When you look at the white population, that changes in terms of the seat distribution potential. Certainly on the Hispanic population, you have 13 theoretic seats in total population, but it goes down to 11.4 seats in voting age population. These dynamics are what takes place in redistricting. Next slide. Indeed, if we look at the overall population of the country, nationwide, whites were 72.4% of the population, but 2 or more races were that 3%. Next slide shows what happens if you take that 2 or more and distribute that amongst the various races. You can see how that changes slightly for the characteristics. These are some of the things that we'll be dealing with once again in 2020. Next slide. One of the things that also you need to be aware of from a data perspective is the elections process and how this changes. Next one. Indeed, if we look at total population from an election process, well, certainly you have total population, but not everyone can vote. Indeed, the next slide shows that you have to be a voting age population. And not everyone of voting age can vote. Indeed, next one, you have to be a citizen in this country to vote. Not all citizens of voting age can vote. Indeed, you have to be registered. And not all registered voters voting. In fact, only parts of them do. Turnout goes down. But with even turnout, not everyone votes for every office. So indeed, vote for president is less than turnout. And all the different other offices that there are, you drop down this stepping stone of the elections process. What's important is that those racial characteristics that I talked about before, at each step of this elections process, those racial characteristics change depending upon the jurisdiction, depending upon the state, depending upon the area that you're drawing. And it's important from a redistricting standpoint, if you're going to put together a plan, you need to know all of these kind of steps and what happens in your jurisdiction. Indeed, you can't take a standard of, well, we have to create districts that are 65%. You have to look at the individual area and see the stepping stone, what takes place, whether or not you need districts that high or not. These are some of the considerations that everyone is going to have to take a look at. Indeed, so if we look at the next slide then, one of the things in conclusion we can be looking at from in previous decades is an Olympic command for the redistricting season. So we can let the games begin. And indeed, this will be, whatever state you're in, the 5th Olympiad since the Warren Court forced America into the ideological straitjacket of one person, one vote. Like the first 4 times we've done this, it will feature outstanding legislative warfare, after which the combatants will go to court and ask a judge who won. With that, thank you very much. There's my information where you can find things, and you can order that poster if you were interested. Monty, back to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Kim. And now we will have Lisa Sornin, who again serves as Executive Director of the State and Local Legal Center based here right in Washington, D.C. Lisa?
Thank you, Kawanzi. I am going to talk about 2 Supreme Court cases this term affecting redistricting. The first case is Alabama Legislative Black Caucus versus Alabama. Now, on the surface of things, it seems like a very uncontroversial case. The question is, does maintaining the same percentage of black voters in a majority-minority district amount to unconstitutional racial gerrymandering? Next slide. So as this case comes out of Alabama, it's somewhat of a long story. It involves state legislative redistricting. So in 1990, there was no agreement on a redistricting plan. So a court drew a plan that had 27 majority-minority districts for the House and 8 for the Senate. So in 2000, the Democrats had control of the legislature, and they maintained basically the status quo, the same number of majority-minority districts. Then in 2010, the Republicans gained control, and they noted that a number of majority-minority districts were underpopulated, and it had a lot to do with population shifts and which demographics were growing and which weren't. So the Republicans set out to redistrict, and they agreed to 3 goals. First, they wanted no more than 2% deviation in the population among districts to meet the one person, one vote requirement. Then they wanted to preserve the number of majority-minority districts, and the third goal was to maintain the percent of black voters in the majority-minority districts. And it's that third point that really becomes controversial, although the points are all sort of woven together in the controversy. Okay, so next slide. So the result of the redistricting based on those 3 goals, black voters said, was that they were packed into districts where they were already a solid majority. And the result of this, they said, was it now became difficult for them in districts where they were a minority to form a coalition to get the representatives elected that they wanted. So as evidence, they cited the fact that 70% of districts that were between 30 and 50% black were moved to majority-minority districts. And it's probably a controversial point that the percentage of black voters in the majority-minority districts before redistricting was often quite high, sometimes approaching 65 to 70%. Okay, next slide. So the Alabama legislature said this is unconstitutional racial gerrymandering, which basically means, or basically what they were arguing is that race cannot be used as a predominant factor in redistricting, and that's what happened here. The legislature set essentially a quota, according to the Black Legislative Caucus, and said that's how many, or that's the percent of black voters we want in each district. Alabama essentially said Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act made us do this. As a result of Section 5, as you know, before it was struck down in the Shelby County case, states that had a history of voting discrimination had to be pre-cleared if they made any voting changes. And they basically, in the pre-clearance process, had to show that they weren't making minority voters any worse off. So Alabama basically said, you know, if we reduce those percents, then we would have been violating Section 5. So essentially, Section 5 made us do it. Okay, next slide. So there was a 3-judge panel that decided the case before the Supreme Court got it. And 2 judges, both Republican appointees, sided with Alabama. They said, you know, the primary motive in redistricting wasn't race. It was complying with one person, one vote, hence that only 2% deviation. And dividing up, you know, votes on the basis of race made sense in this context because Section 5 said no retrogression. Essentially, you can't make voting harder for minorities. And the court pointed out, as I mentioned before, that basically this redistricting plan was okay, or something similar to it, when the Democrats were in power. So one judge dissented. He said, look, race was the motivating factor in the redistricting here. And Section 5 has never said that you have to maintain the same percent of minority voters. It generally says, or has generally been interpreted to say that the districts have to remain, you have to keep about the same number of districts, but not that in each district you have to have a certain percent of voters. And then the dissenting judge pointed out Section 5 is defunct anyway. So next slide. So this case has basically unending ironies. Probably the most interesting irony is that racial gerrymandering cases have historically been brought by Republicans claiming that it was Democrats who were engaged in racial gerrymandering. Here, of course, we have the reverse kind of claim. And then the other irony is you have Alabama arguing, look, Section 5 made us do this. Meanwhile, Alabama is fighting successfully to strike down Section 4, which practically speaking leads down to the striking down of Section 5 in the Shelby County case decided 2 years ago. Next slide. So there's a couple big picture questions the court has to struggle with when it decides this case. The first one is how much use of race is too much? I guess the troubling thing about all this is that you know, some consideration has to be made of race. Everyone agrees on that, but it can't be the predominant factor. Well, what does that mean? And the court has to figure it out. So the second question the court has to wrestle with is this race or is this politics? If you're a Republican, of course you want to pack more reliably Democratic voters into fewer districts. And so considering blacks in Alabama vote so, their voting is so highly correlated with their status as Democrats that, you know, it's hard to sort of tease out, was Alabama focusing on race or was it just focusing on party? Because they're so connected. And, you know, the third thing the court has to figure out is there's been some research indicating that, you know, back in the day when black voter turnout was low and registration was low, it made sense to have high numbers of African Americans in districts. But now, when you have black voting turnout and registration as high as white turnout and registration, maybe you don't need districts to be 70%. So the other reason why I think this case is sort of interesting is that it's the only race-related case on the court's docket. And this is a court that's deeply interested in race cases and deeply hostile to the use of race as a distinguishing factor. And so it's interesting to see the court take this case. Next slide. So the question now is who is likely to win this case? Oral argument has been heard in this case. I did not attend the oral argument, but I read on, I have to admit that this commentary comes largely from Richard Heston, who did an analysis of the case, an analysis of the oral argument for SCOTUS blog. He predicts in a lukewarm fashion that Alabama will win. He says the court basically has three options. It can reject the racial gerrymandering claim, and the conservatives seem inclined to do that. Justice Roberts, I believe, made the point I was making before, which is Alabama said, look, if we actually had reduced the percentage of black voters, we would have been in trouble. So how can this really be racial gerrymandering now? The case could be remanded to do some fact-finding for what the legislature's motivation was. The United States has suggested this as an outcome in the case. None of the justices seemed all that enthused about it, according to Richard Heston. And then the court could, of course, reject Alabama's plan as racial gerrymandering, which it didn't appear, at least to this comment here, that the court had the votes to do that. So the question in a case like this, especially considering, like I said, the court doesn't look favorably in general on racial distinctions, at least the conservatives on the court don't. So this is possibly going to be another 5-4 decision, maybe not, where Justice Kennedy's vote will really make a difference. And he was very perplexed by the idea I mentioned before, which is that black voters tend to vote Democrat. So of course, Republicans want to put them in a couple of jurisdictions and leave them be, essentially. And he was troubled by the idea that that it's hard to tease out whether it's race or whether it's really just politics. So next slide. So the second case that the oh wait, I guess I missed this case, or I missed this slide. Sorry. So the question that you all might be wondering is how will this case impact, you know, states? And of course, it depends on how courts rule. or how the court rules. One question might be, are there other states out there where a similar racial gerrymandering claim could be made? Justin Levette wrote an article, and if I have the title of it written on the slide, and you can tell that he has a bias just by the title of his article. But he basically suggests that there's a number of states that have used what he calls demographically determining approaches. In other words, the same process that Alabama allegedly used of saying, like, look, we want a quota of black voters in each jurisdiction. And so if the court says that's not okay, the redistricting of the jurisdictions on this slide, according to Mr. Levette, could be in question. So in other words, if Alabama loses, there is a number of other states that might be in trouble. If Alabama wins, the flip side is, are there other states that are going to want to use their model for redistricting and use more of a quota-based system for determining how to redistrict, essentially? Okay, next slide. So now I'm going to get to the Arizona State Legislature versus Arizona Redistricting Commission case. So I've been a state local legal center now for 3 years, and in my opinion, this is the biggest case for state legislatures, not for states in general, but in state legislatures in a time that I've been at the SLLC, though in truth, it really only affects one, arguably, probably 2 states. So the Constitution has an election clause, and it basically says that Congress can come up with a time, place, and manner of elections, or rather that state legislatures can come up with this, but Congress can have some input if it so likes on some of those requirements. So in general, legislatures have been a key part of redistricting over the course of history. Arizona in 2000. By proposition, took the redistricting authority entirely away from the state legislature and put it in an independent redistricting commission. So only the redistricting commission can do redistricting without any input from the state legislature. So the bottom line question in this case is, can state legislatures be entirely cut out of the redistricting process? Next slide. So a lot of states, as the last speaker mentioned, maintain redistricting commissions. That's not uncommon. But usually the state legislature plays a key role in redistricting. It's only Arizona and California where the legislature doesn't really play any role at all. If you want more details on this, the National Conference of State Legislatures filed an amicus brief, and it describes the voluntary commissions. In theory, the use of these voluntary commissions, whether they're advisory, backup, or politically appointed, are not in play in the case, but amicus briefs on the other side say they are. So I would take that with a grain of salt, but I think it's really just the Arizona and the California legislature that will be impacted. Next slide. So like I said, this change came out as a result of a referendum in 2000. And basically, commissioners are chosen by, in kind of an odd process. The state's commission on appellate court appointments comes up with a list. So this isn't a group that has any history with redistricting. It's the appellate court appointments commission comes up with a list of people, and then the 2 parties in the House and the Senate get to pick someone. And it ends up being 5 people who are ultimately on the commission. Next slide. So the Arizona District Court ruled against the Arizona legislature in this case. There are basically 2 prior Supreme Court cases. One is from 1916 and one is from 1932. So they are dated, to say the least. And in those cases, the Supreme Court said it doesn't violate the election clause to have the governor, if the governor can veto a redistricting plan, or if the voters can disapprove a redistricting plan by referendum. But a dissenting judge points out that in those cases, the legislature was still deeply involved. For example, in the second case, it's just that their plan could be vetoed by the governor, but the legislature still had a significant role. Next slide. So the court has a number of big picture issues it has to wrestle with in this case. The first one is, what is a legislature? Is it the actual body, or is it legislative power? Those are 2 different things. And sort of related to that is the concept of representative democracy versus direct democracy. So the commission wants to say, look, this is direct democracy. The voters of Arizona wanted this. And the Arizona legislature says, no, we have a representative democracy in this case. Like, that's how, or in our country, that's how things work here. So working in the background, I think, is the issue of gerrymander or partisan gerrymandering. It's no coincidence that this case came out of Arizona, where there's been a lot of political gerrymandering. And I think that'll be in the back of the minds of the justices. And quite frankly, amicus briefs discuss gerrymandering at length. But the reality is both parties can use gerrymandering to their side, at least in theory. Political gerrymandering, that is. Next slide. So there are really two issues in this case that are basically on the periphery, and I won't get into them because they basically got no attention at all at oral argument. And that is whether the Arizona legislature even had standing to sue, and then whether this federal statute affects the outcome of the case. I would talk about these if I think they'd make a difference, but I really don't. So next slide. So I had the pleasure of attending the oral argument in this case, and my prediction on this case is that Arizona will win. I don't think it's obvious that this case would be a liberal-conservative split because, like I said, in theory, either party can take advantage of partisan gerrymandering. But the conservatives seemed inclined to vote for the Arizona legislature and against the commission. So I was sitting in the audience on the day of oral argument, and all eyes are on Justice Kennedy. And he asked a lot of questions of Arizona, which meant that in theory he was suspicious of their position. But then he eventually got to questioning the Arizona Redistricting Commission, and he said, the history where in the United States the senators were picked by legislatures rather than by the electorate works very much against you. Those are his exact words. And I could hear the press people scribbling that down, that they saw that as like Justice Kennedy sort of expressing his disdain for the Arizona Redistricting Commission's position. Justice Kagan was the harshest critic of Arizona's position, the legislature's position. She basically said, if we have to keep the legislature involved, how much do we have to keep them involved? Are we going to end up litigating every case to determine how much the legislature has to be involved? So that was her point. Next slide. So how will this case impact the states? I guess, again, it depends on how the court rules. If Arizona wins, Arizona's Redistricting Commission will have to change or it will go away, I guess, one of the two. California's Redistricting Commission might also have to change. And then there may be litigation, as Justice Kagan predicts, over whether other commissions sort of go too far in taking away legislative authority in redistricting. If Arizona loses, I think the big question is this: will other states cut legislatures out of the redistricting process entirely? That is sort of the million-dollar question. So next slide. Okay, so these were, I'm actually going to conclude here. I have some additional slides that relate to questions that that Kamanzi had said ahead of time, but they're not a specific presentation on the cases. So if we want to discuss those questions later, Kwanzi, I'd be happy to do that, but at this point, I will conclude.
That's fine. Thank you, Lisa. Now we will have a presentation by Professor Jonathan Mattingly, Professor of Mathematics and Statistical Science at Duke University. Professor Mattingly?
Hi. Thank you very much again for inviting me to talk. What I want to, just go ahead to the first slide. What I want to do is present it, and there's actually only one slide, because what I want to present is, some beginnings of some ongoing research which we think maybe gives an interesting window into asking about the question of redistricting. Maybe this audience won't be as surprised, but we really were motivated by asking, how much was gerrymandering? I mean, when does the term gerrymandering come into play? When is an advantage gerrymandering? I live in North Carolina, and this was really initially motivated, although I'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing now, by the 2012 congressional elections in North Carolina, where the majority of North Carolinians voted Democratic, but yet there were 9 of 13 Republicans elected to the congressional seats, to Congress. And, a lot of people, that was a cause for outcry among certain circles, but it got a number of people thinking. Other people said, well, there's differences in the states. There's differences between the urban and the rural, the mountains and the the coast, the Piedmonts, and those give rise to natural region. If we want to preserve regionalism, an important concept in our government, that maybe this was just the outcome. So we want to sit around and think about a way that we could try to answer that question. And in doing so, we kind of came up with a technique which you might frame as not a way to redistrict, but a way to maybe provide diagnostics to redistricting, and maybe, or alternatively, to suss out the will of the people that's encoded in a certain set of votes. So let me first just describe a little what we did, and then I'll talk about the results, and then I'll tell you maybe most importantly what we're doing next and how that might inform this discussion, and how hopefully we're listening to what people are talking about, and how that's going to inform, and maybe the questions, if anyone has any, will inform what we do next. So what we did was we took the 2012 congressional elections in North Carolina. We had information at the precinct level of how each precinct voted. And what we did was we randomly redraw the districting lines. That is to say, we drew new redistrictings of North Carolina that were loosely based on the historical redistricts, the historical congressional districts, but they moved the boundaries around, and all they really tried to do was we really want to keep this as simple as possible, so we're not enforcing all the legal requirements. We only really picked the two primary legal requirements, that is to say, equidistribution of the population, so each district should have as close as possible to 1/13 of the population of the state, and the districts should be relatively compact. They shouldn't be too strung out, of course, leaving aside the famous North Carolina 12th district, which is anything but compact, which dates back to questions about majority-minority districts. So we did that, and we drew a couple hundred random redistricts, and then we ran the 2012 elections again. We just let everyone cast their votes exactly as they had cast their votes, but now they were in different districts. And the one chart that I've put here is the outcome, the frequency of the number of Democrats that were elected. And so let me remind you that during that period there were 4 Democrats elected. And now if you draw the districts randomly, it seems that on average around 7, not on average, but the typical number is 7, and sometimes 6, sometimes 8, but we never single time saw 4 districts, 4 Democrats elected, that is to say. So this really kind of gives some idea of, well, is this democracy? If here's the will of the people, if one vote, one person is all we ever enforce, then one vote, one person could lead to this wide distribution of possible outcomes. And if you just randomly draw the districts without paying careful attention to where you split communities and where you pack communities, you typically get around 7 Democrats elected. And that's, so we took this to draw into question, how democratic was the process that we had. And what we're hoping to do is advocate for the types of bipartisan or nonpartisan redistricting commissions. And this summer, we're going to, in fact, analyze a number of other states, and particularly ones that we think are gerrymandered towards the Democrats, ones that we think are gerrymandered toward the Republicans, and ones that use bipartisan commissions, such as Idaho, or maybe, well, California is a better example, and see what the outcome is. Since the Voting Rights Act is an important player in all this, we also looked actually, and I don't have that graph here, we also looked as to what the biggest minority-majority district we had was. Now, none of our districts were close to the current, which is over 50%, but we did typically get one district that was around 38% African American. And in our next set of investigations, we're going to start seeing if we start setting requirements to favor districts, that is, when we draw these random districts, not only to draw ones that are compact and equally split, but also ones that favor having at least one majority-minority district, or one that has at least 40%, or one that has 45, or at what different levels, see how that changes this distribution of outcome results. I think that's kind of all I wanted to say. I just want to emphasize that we were not proposing a way to automate the election, the production of redistricting. What we're really trying to do is give some idea about how to decide whether a particular redistricting was representative. I might say that something in the middle of what the distribution of possible outcomes would be a representative redistricting, whereas ones that are far out in the tails, far away from the typical results, might be questionable as to their legitimacy and the way in which they represent the will of the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mattingly. We have a few questions that have been given to me from the audience that I will open it up to the panel to respond to. Some really good questions. The first question I see, it's saying, specifically addressing the issue of gerrymandering, can nonpartisan commissions similar to the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission alleviate gerrymandering?
Well, I can take that. This is Kim Brace. Basically, we've done redistricting with commissions and without commissions in a number of different states. Commissions don't always take away partisanship. In fact, when you draw districts, anytime you draw districts, it will have a partisan outcome. The question is how to deal with that and to understand that. But certainly, any kind of line drawing will have an anticipated or unanticipated outcome, but it will have a political impact. So certainly, I don't think you can take partisanship out of the redistricting process. I think you just have to understand that it's going to be there, and how do you deal with it?
I guess I would just add that our whole point of view on this was exactly that we never thought that we could remove politics from the discussion. We just wanted to be able to identify when a redistricting was maybe beyond the pale, when it was so far out of whack with what was being expressed in the votes that maybe it should be reconsidered.
So
Lisa.
this is Lisa here. So in the Arizona case, there were tons of amicus briefs filed, basically contemplating that question and suggesting that redistricting commissions can help reduce gerrymandering. But the question is, anyone can say that, but what does the evidence show? On my PowerPoint, I have there was one brief in particular. It was a brief of a number of individuals, Nathaniel, someone or other, Bruce Kane, and they looked at all the research, or purported to look at all the research on this topic, and they basically said that there are three conclusions that you can draw, which is that these commissions are less likely to produce results that are extremely partisan biased, which is probably a somewhat obvious commission, or obvious conclusion, that they're more likely to pass their plans on time, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but the writer suggested it is because it allows people to decide whether they're going to run for office earlier, et cetera. And of course, using these commissions, relieves the legislature of the burden of having to engage in presumably a very partisan activity. I guess from a practical perspective, as you look at that question in terms of case, the question might be, does the Supreme Court care? The Supreme Court has basically said, that partisan gerrymandering is okay. They haven't, stood in the way of it, but it's something that bothers a lot of people for good reason. So I think it would be great to see more research and more evidence coming to more clear conclusions about the effectiveness of redistricting commissions in that manner.
One other aspect to also think about from Lisa's standpoint and what she talked about with Arizona, in terms of if you look at this case, the commission started in the 2000 round of redistricting. And in fact, in the 2000 round, the Republicans were more strongly involved with the commission, and therefore the commission in that round drew a Republican-favored plan. Indeed, the legislature did not challenge that plan. It let it sit there for the decade, I mean. In 2010, the Democrats had the advantage on the commission, and they drew a more democratic plan, and that's when the legislature challenged it. So it's interesting to see the dichotomy of the roles of individuals when it deals with the redistricting process.
Thank you, Kim. I have another question. I want to address it first to Professor Mattingly. And this question reads, is there any hope to an equitable solution to redistricting? How would you respond to that, Professor Mattingly?
Well, I guess, I'm I guess part of our question that we were asking ourselves was what was equitable, right?
Sure.
And that was exactly what we were trying to get at. So I think as far as what my contribution, if any, to this discussion is that we're trying to come up with a way to decide what is equitable. Now, whether we can find the political will and the political constructions and the legal constructions to move us there is a different question, which is part of that question. So I think what we're doing, hopefully, as we flesh it out and increase it, will give some indication of when a redistricting is, representative of what the people voted.
This is Kim again. I guess the real question is Professor, in what you ended up doing, you looked at the partisanness of the plan, which is certainly one factor,
right.
But you admitted that you really didn't have the racial component in there.
Well,
yes, please. I mean, you're going to be doing more research, which is good. But when one does redistricting, basically there's 3 tiers of factors that one has to take into account. First, of course, has to be equal population, one person, one vote. But secondly, according to the court's decisions, minority voting strength needs to be fairly reflected. And only thirdly is a 3rd tier of factors that includes partisanness. It could include incumbency. It could include multiple jurisdictions being split. I kind of look at that 3rd tier as kind of a kitchen sink of any other kind of ideas that people have. But basically the courts have said that you need to do it in that kind of an order. Equal population first, minority voting strength second, and third, all the other factors.
I understand completely, and in fact, I mean, we are going to increase the weighting of minority-majority districts. We did have close to 40% African American in at least one, and almost the same in the 2nd district. So we weren't completely marginalizing that. And that was randomly sampling, right? Of course, it'll be interesting to see what changes when we weight more, so that we, for instance, guarantee at least one minority majority. But like I said, since part of our point of view was to decide what was actually being expressed by the votes, not necessarily provide a legally possible redistricting, there's then a discussion as to what the effects of the current legal structures are on that will being expressed, if you see what I'm saying, right?
Right.
What the courts could value could be changed with legislation, right?
Well, it will be interesting in getting back to Lisa's presentation on her first case, the Alabama case. That is actually very significant from a redistricting standpoint because it gets to the heart of how politics can play into the redistricting process and whether or not you create districts that are so overwhelmingly or you spread out the population. And indeed, if you look at redistricting over time, Democrats have tended to create coalition type of districts where nothing is really totally strong for one group or another, but they spread them out, while the Republicans, when they had control of the process starting in 2010, they started to move towards the packing kind of circumstances that we saw in a number of different states. We'll have to see what the court does in the Alabama case on how that kind of a strategy, will that work one way or the other.
Okay, and I have a question from Michael Stewart, and it reads, with both Arizona and California, their redistricting commissions remove the final decision-making for redistricting from the legislature. A few states have advisory commissions. Do you think the Arizona case could impact the validity of these advisory type of commissions, particularly since the final decisions would still lie with the legislature? And I would address that to Lisa first.
Sure. In theory, I think the most likely outcome for this case is that the court will just talk about commissions in terms of the legislature having no role. because that's the situation that Arizona and California are in. That's the most likely outcome, just because the court likes to make narrow rulings, likes to not decide, likes to only decide the issues that are in front of it, and likes to keep sort of all other things as a case for another day. That said, as I mentioned earlier, a number of groups submitted amicus briefs saying, look, voluntary commissions are on the line, this case impacts them. So it all depends on what the court writes and how broadly they write their decision. But chances are the voluntary commissions will not be impacted by this case.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you all very much for participating today. This has been a policy conversation with Kimball Brace, Lisa Sornin, and Professor Jonathan Mattingly. Thank you all for joining us again, and we will see you next time. Take care.